So there I was, Jake Martinez, from Detroit, somehow sitting in the most prestigious military academy in the galaxy. And when I say somehow, I really mean it. Because apparently filling out the wrong scholarship application while half asleep can land you in some pretty weird places. Who knew that checking the box for willing to relocate for educational opportunities would result in actual relocation to a different solar system? The Galactic Naval Academy, where the best and brightest from across known space come to learn the fine art of not dying in the void. Naturally, they had exactly one human in the entire program. Me, the token representative of the species that still uses combustion engines and thinks duct tape is a legitimate engineering solution. My bunkmates were a fascinating collection of what the Academy called peak evolutionary specimens. First there was Zephyr, an avian who looked like someone had crossed a peacock with a nervous accountant. Every feather on his 7-foot frame seemed to vibrate with anxiety, and he carried around 3 different copies of the Academy handbook because, and I quote, Regulation 47B clearly states that redundancy prevents regulatory violations. Then we had Grok, a granite who stood 8 feet tall and was built like a mountain that had decided to go to the gym. His species evolved on a planet where the primary survival strategy was being harder than whatever was trying to kill you. Grok's solution to most problems involved finding something to headbutt, and so far this approach had served him remarkably well. Finally, there was Pip, a micro-being who stood all of 3 feet tall but whose brain apparently operated at frequencies that made quantum computers look like pocket calculators. Pip could calculate the trajectory of a comet while simultaneously analyzing the social dynamics of our study group and predicting what we'd have for lunch next Tuesday. The downside was that all this processing power meant he spent most conversations 6 steps ahead of everyone else and had to constantly backtrack to explain what he was talking about. Our current assignment was what the Academy cheerfully called a routine environmental adaptation exercise on Kepler 442c, a training planet specifically chosen for its perfectly controlled and predictable weather systems. The brochure practically glowed with enthusiasm about how the planet's atmospheric processors maintained ideal conditions year-round. No surprises, no unexpected variables, just a nice, safe, boring rock where cadets could practice basic survival skills without any actual risk of not surviving. The instructors kept referring to it as Earth-like, which I found hilarious since apparently their idea of Earth-like meant a planet where weather exists but has been lobotomized into submission. They seemed genuinely proud of having removed all the inconvenient bits like storms, temperature fluctuations, or anything that might require actual adaptation. Cadet Martinez, Zephyr had said during our pre-mission briefing, consulting his handbook for the 15th time that morning, according to Section 12.7 of the Environmental Protocols Manual. Humans are classified as a Tier C survival species. This means you'll need additional monitoring during the exercise. Tier C, charming. Apparently this was because humans were considered resourceful but unpredictable, with a concerning tendency toward improvisation when proper protocols exist. The handbook actually used the phrase concerning tendency, like my species' habit of making things work with whatever was lying around, was some kind of character flaw. Grok had just grunted and flexed his shoulder muscles, which on a granite was roughly equivalent to rolling your eyes. Humans built okay. Soft, but okay. Not break easy like most small things. High praise from a guy whose idea of a handshake could crush walnuts. Pip, meanwhile, had been running calculations on his personal datapad. Statistical analysis indicates a 97.3% probability of mission success given current parameters. The remaining 2.7% accounts for equipment malfunction, user error, or unforeseen environmental variables. However, given the planet's controlled climate systems, unforeseen environmental variables have a probability approaching 0. Right, 0 probability of weather doing anything unexpected on a planet where weather was treated like a well-trained pet that only performed on command. As we prepared to shuttle down to the surface, I couldn't help but notice how confident everyone seemed. The instructors were practically bored. The other cadets were treating this like a field trip, and even the Academy's risk assessment AI had filed the mission under routine training with minimal supervision required. Looking back, I should have known right then that we were absolutely screwed. In my experience, the universe has a special sense of humor about the word routine. The moment anyone in authority declares something routine, that's when reality decides to get creative. But hey, what did I know? I was just the Tier C human along for the ride. So there we were. 6 hours into what was supposed to be the galaxy's most boring survival exercise, when the sky decided to have what I can only describe as a complete psychological breakdown. It started subtle, the way disasters always do. A few clouds that weren't on the weather schedule, a breeze that the atmospheric processors hadn't ordered. Pip noticed first, naturally, because his brain was constantly running background scans on everything within a 50-mile radius. Anomalous atmospheric pressure detected, he announced, staring at his scanner with the kind of expression usually reserved for discovering your pet goldfish has learned calculus. Current barometric readings are deviating from predicted parameters by 0.03%. 0.03%. On any normal planet, that would qualify as Tuesday. But this was Kepler 442c, where the weather was supposed to be more predictable than a metronome with OCD. Zephyr immediately began flipping through his handbook, feathers rustling with increasing agitation. There's no protocol for atmospheric deviation during routine exercises. This isn't covered in Section 15, subsection C, or any of the appendices. Grok looked up at the gathering clouds and shrugged his massive shoulders. Sky looks angry. Maybe Sky needs punching. I was about to suggest that maybe, just maybe, we should start thinking about shelter, when the Academy's emergency communication system crackled to life with the kind of announcement that makes your stomach drop into your boots. Attention all cadets. We are experiencing a minor technical difficulty with the planetary weather management system. Please remain calm and continue with your exercises. Technical teams are addressing the issue. This is not a drill, but it's also not particularly concerning. Please remain calm. Now I've lived on Earth for 19 years, and I've learned that when authority figures tell you not to be concerned about something twice in the same sentence, that's exactly when you should start being very concerned indeed. The clouds were building now, going from mildly inconvenient to ominous to someone definitely angered a weather god. They were the kind of dark gray that usually requires a meteorology degree to properly appreciate, stacking up like nature's own game of Jenga played by someone with serious anger management issues. According to my calculations, Pip announced, his voice climbing an octave, the probability of precipitation has increased from 0.1% to 47% in the last 6 minutes. This is statistically impossible given the planet's climate control systems. Zephyr was now frantically leafing through a second handbook. There has to be a regulation for impossible weather. There's a regulation for everything. That's when the first raindrop hit. Now you have to understand, none of these guys had ever seen actual uncontrolled weather before. Their home planets either had perfect climate control or weather so predictable you could set your watch by it. Rain that showed up uninvited was like having gravity suddenly decide to work sideways. The drop hit Grok square on his rocky forehead with a little plink sound. He stared up at the sky with the kind of confusion usually reserved for discovering that 2 + 2 = purple. Water falls from sky, he announced, as if he'd just witnessed the laws of physics filing for divorce. That's not scheduled. Zephyr squawked, literally squawked, as more drops began to fall. Rain is supposed to occur between 0200 and 0400 hours on alternating Tuesdays. It's Wednesday. This is highly irregular. Pip's scanner was now beeping like a smoke detector with anxiety issues. Precipitation increasing exponentially. Current rate suggests total accumulation of, oh dear, oh dear, oh dear, what's oh dear, what's oh dear? I asked though I was pretty sure I didn't want to know. According to these readings, we're looking at approximately 6 inches of rainfall in the next hour. 6 inches, on a planet where the drainage systems were designed to handle maybe a light mist every other week. That's when the sky opened up like someone had torn a hole in the universe's water balloon. The rain came down in sheets, in buckets, in whatever unit of measurement you use for way too much water way too fast. Within minutes, our nice controlled training ground started looking less like a carefully maintained exercise area, and more like the world's least convenient swimming pool. Zephyr was now shouting regulations at the storm as if he could lawyer it into submission. Regulation 23A clearly states that environmental conditions must remain within acceptable parameters. This is unacceptable. I demand to speak to the storm's supervisor. Grok had adopted his species' traditional response to unexpected problems, which was to find something to hit. Unfortunately, you can't punch rain, though he was certainly giving it his best effort, swinging his massive fists at individual raindrops with the determination of someone who refused to accept that physics didn't work that way. Pip had gone full panic mode, his calculations becoming increasingly frantic. Water accumulation rate exceeding ground absorption capacity. Drainage systems operating at 12% efficiency. Projected flooding depth reaching critical levels in 17 minutes and 34 seconds. We're all going to die. Statistically speaking, we're all going to die very efficiently. Meanwhile, I was standing there getting soaked and thinking about something my dad had told me when I was 8 years old, and we got caught in a thunderstorm during a camping trip. Jake, he'd said, When nature decides to remind you who's boss, you don't argue with it. You adapt, you improvise, and you definitely don't try to file a complaint. The water was already ankle deep and rising fast. Our advanced alien classmates were responding to this crisis with all the effectiveness of a chocolate teapot, and I was starting to realize that my tier's survival rating might have been less about my limitations and more about everyone else's complete inability to handle anything that wasn't printed in a manual. The Academy's communication system crackled again, this time with considerably less confidence. Attention cadets, the minor technical difficulty has become a moderate technical difficulty. Please continue to remain calm, and perhaps find higher ground. But calmly, very calmly. Higher ground was looking pretty good right about now, except for one small problem. We were in the middle of a perfectly flat training field, surrounded by perfectly flat terrain, because apparently the Academy's idea of realistic training conditions was geographically boring. That's when I started looking around for anything that might float. What happened next was like watching the galaxy's most expensive comedy show, except nobody was laughing because we were all slowly drowning. The water was now knee-deep and climbing with the enthusiasm of a caffeinated elevator. Our training equipment was floating around like toys in a bathtub, and the emergency shelter kits that were supposed to deploy automatically had instead decided this was the perfect time to malfunction in spectacular fashion. Apparently the designers had never considered that emergency shelters might need to work during actual emergencies. Zephyr had appointed himself chief regulatory officer of the crisis. He was standing in the rising water, still clutching his handbook, addressing the storm with the kind of righteous indignation usually reserved for customer service complaints. "Attention atmospheric disturbance," he announced in his most official voice, water now lapping at his chest feathers. "You are in direct violation of Galactic Academy Regulation 47C, which clearly states that weather phenomena must adhere to predetermined parameters during training exercises. I am hereby issuing you a formal citation for unlawful precipitation." The storm, apparently unimpressed by bureaucratic intimidation, responded by dumping another gallon of water directly onto Zephyr's head. Undeterred, Zephyr began composing what he called an official incident report on his waterproof datapad. Time of violation 1437 hours. Nature of violation, excessive water displacement without proper authorization. Severity, Class B regulatory breach, with potential escalation to Class A if precipitation continues beyond approved parameters. He actually tried to submit this report to the Academy's administrative system, from the middle of a flood, while standing waist-deep in water that wasn't supposed to exist. The system predictably rejected his filing because weather complaints must be submitted during normal business hours with appropriate departmental pre-approval. "This is highly irregular," Zephyr squawked, frantically scrolling through his handbook for flood-specific regulations. "There's supposed to be a protocol for everything. Where's the protocol for impossible weather?" Meanwhile, Grok had decided that if the problem was too much water, the solution was obviously to remove the water through superior granite engineering. His species had built some of the galaxy's most impressive stone cities by applying the fundamental principle that most problems could be solved by hitting them really, really hard. "Grok fix water problem," he announced with the confidence of someone whose planet's emergency response plan was basically throw rocks at it until it stops. His first attempt involved trying to punch the water back down into the ground. Picture, if you will, an 8-foot mountain of living rock standing in flood water, throwing haymakers at the surface like he was in a boxing match with the entire concept of liquid. "Bad water," he grunted between punches. "Go down, stay down." When that didn't work, he tried a more sophisticated approach. Construction. Grok began grabbing debris from the floating training equipment and piling it up to create what he proudly called a granite-style fortress. The fortress lasted approximately 37 seconds. "Fortress not stay up," Grok observed with the kind of scientific detachment that comes from watching your engineering project collapse into a soggy pile of disappointment. "Water too sneaky. Gets under rocks when not looking." He tried rebuilding the fortress. Twice. Each attempt was more ambitious than the last, and each failure was more spectacular. The third fortress actually fell over before he finished building it, as if the laws of physics had gotten tired of waiting and decided to intervene preemptively. "Grok not understand," he muttered, staring at the soggy remains of fortress attempt number 3. "Rock's supposed to be stronger than water. Is basic rule of universe." Pip, meanwhile, had gone into full analytical meltdown. His processor-like brain was generating solutions at quantum speed, but unfortunately, all of them required equipment that was either underwater, on fire, or simply didn't exist on a planet designed for boring safe exercises. "Solution number 47, he announced, scrolling through his datapad with increasing desperation. We construct a reverse atmospheric processor to halt precipitation at the molecular level. Required materials: 3 quantum flux capacitors, a gravitational field generator, and approximately 14 tons of refined antimatter. He paused, checking his calculations. Current antimatter availability, 0 tons. Scratch solution 47. Solution number 48. We establish a localized temporal field to revert weather conditions to pre-storm parameters. Required materials: 1 temporal manipulation device, Class A clearance from the Galactic Time Authority, and a really good lawyer in case we accidentally erase ourselves from existence. Another pause. Another disappointment. Solution number 49. We dig a tunnel to the planet's core and drain the flood water into the molten interior. Required materials: industrial drilling equipment rated for planetary excavation, heat-resistant environmental suits, and probably some form of insurance that covers death by lava. Pip was now generating solutions faster than he could reject them, his voice climbing to higher and higher octaves as his options became increasingly impossible. Solution number 83. We train the water to behave properly through positive reinforcement. Solution number 84. We file a lawsuit against gravity for enabling this situation. Solution number 85. We all learn to photosynthesize and become plants so we actually benefit from excessive water. The poor guy's brain was basically screaming "does not compute" while trying to solve a problem that required the kind of simple practical thinking that apparently wasn't covered in Advanced Theoretical Problem Solving 101. The Academy's emergency systems were having their own spectacular failures. The emergency beacon that was supposed to summon help had instead started playing what sounded like elevator music at maximum volume. The automatic distress signal kept broadcasting the message "all cadets are safe and accounted for, exercise proceeding normally," while we stood there obviously not safe and definitely not normal. The emergency supply pods that should have contained flotation devices had instead deployed packets of dehydrated rations and a helpful pamphlet titled "So You've Encountered Mild Weather. A Guide to Staying Calm." Even the Academy's AI was having problems. Its cheerful automated announcements were becoming increasingly contradictory. Please remain calm, do not panic. Panic is normal, please abnormally calm, remain please. Error 404, appropriate response not found. And through all of this chaos, through Zephyr's regulatory warfare against meteorology, Grok's engineering battle with basic physics, and Pip's mathematical meltdown, I was quietly doing something that apparently nobody else had considered. I was looking around, not at datapads or handbooks or theoretical solutions, but at actual stuff. Physical objects. Things that existed in the real world and might actually be useful for not drowning. Floating debris from the collapsed training structures. Emergency equipment that had failed in interesting ways. Cables and connectors from the malfunctioned weather control systems. Even some of the trees that the landscaping team had planted to make the training ground look more natural. While my classmates were busy trying to solve the flood with regulations, brute force and theoretical physics, I was sizing up materials and mentally calculating load-bearing capacities, buoyancy ratios, and structural integrity. Call it primitive human thinking if you want, but I was pretty sure that what we needed wasn't a better manual or a bigger fist or a more sophisticated equation. What we needed was something that would float, hold our weight, and get us the hell out of here. Time to show these advanced civilizations how a Tier C species handles a little water. While my alien classmates were busy trying to negotiate with physics, I was already knee-deep in what my engineering professors back on Earth would have called applied problem solving, but what everyone else in the galaxy apparently called primitive improvisation. The water was now waist-deep and rising like it had somewhere important to be. Time for some good old-fashioned human stubbornness. First I needed materials. Fortunately, the Academy's perfectly planned training ground had become a floating yard sale of broken equipment. The emergency shelter frames that had failed to deploy were still structurally sound, just useless for their intended purpose. Classic bureaucratic engineering, designing something that worked perfectly except when you actually needed it to work. I started dragging the largest frame pieces toward a slightly higher patch of ground that was still above water. The frames were made from some fancy lightweight alloy that was probably worth more than my dad's car, but right now they were just really expensive sticks. "Martinez," Zephyr called out, still clutching his handbook like a life preserver made of regulations. "What are you doing? There's no protocol for disassembling emergency equipment without proper authorization forms." "I'm not disassembling it," I replied, lashing 2 frame pieces together with the emergency rope that was supposed to secure our tents. "I'm repurposing it." Big difference. Repurposing requires filing a resource reallocation request with the Equipment Management Division, Zephyr insisted, even as the water reached his chest. "In triplicate." I looked at him standing there, neck deep in floodwater, still worried about paperwork. Zephyr, buddy, I'm pretty sure the equipment management division is currently underwater. Meanwhile, Grok had noticed my construction project and wandered over with the curiosity of someone watching an alien ritual, which, from his perspective, I guess it was. Human Jake building something, he observed with the keen analytical skills of his species. Not using big rocks. Strange building method. It's called a raft, Grok. I explained, adding a third frame piece to create a triangular base. It floats on water instead of trying to fight it. Grok considered this concept for a long moment, his rocky features scrunched in concentration. Water winds fight with rocks. Maybe Human Jake has good idea. Can Grok help with not rock building? Finally, someone with sense. Grab those floating equipment pods over there. The ones that were supposed to contain flotation devices but had food packets instead. Grok waded through the flood with the efficiency of a living bulldozer, collecting the waterproof pods like a kid gathering Easter eggs. Each pod was about the size of a backpack and completely sealed, which made them perfect for what I had in mind. Pip appeared at my shoulder, his scanner beeping frantically. What are you constructing? My analysis indicates you're creating some form of buoyancy platform, but the design doesn't match any known naval architecture in my database. That's because it's not in your database, I said, securing the pods under the frame with more rope. This is what we call making it up as you go along. Very popular engineering technique on Earth. But where are the blueprints, the stress analysis calculations, the safety certifications? I paused in my lashing to look at Pip. You want to know the safety certification? If it floats, we don't drown. If it doesn't float, we do drown. That's the entire safety analysis. Pip's scanner nearly exploded from processing this concept. That's remarkably binary. Welcome to human engineering, Pip. We specialize in good enough to not die. As I worked, I could hear the Academy's emergency systems continuing their spectacular malfunction in the background. The automated announcements had progressed from contradictory to completely surreal. Attention cadets. The weather is perfectly normal. Please ignore the water. Water is not wet. Wetness is a state of mind. Please maintain a positive attitude toward your inevitable, your perfectly safe training exercise. The emergency beacon was now playing what sounded like a smooth jazz interpretation of the Academy anthem, while the distress signal kept broadcasting increasingly creative versions of Everything is Fine. The latest update claimed that all cadets were experiencing enhanced hydration opportunities in a controlled aquatic learning environment. But my raft was coming together beautifully. The frame provided structure, the pods provided buoyancy, and the rope provided the kind of engineering elegance that comes from having exactly the right tool for the job, even if that tool is just really good knots. This is highly irregular, Zephyr announced for approximately the 40th time that day. Watercraft construction requires certification from the Maritime Safety Board, environmental impact assessments, and at least 14 different permits. Tell you what, Zephyr, I said, adding the final cross braces to my floating masterpiece. When we get back to dry land, you can file all the permits you want. Right now I'm more concerned with the getting to dry land part. The raft was about 12 feet long and 8 feet wide, big enough to hold all four of us plus some emergency supplies. It wasn't pretty, but it was functional, which put it several steps ahead of everything else that was supposed to work on this planet. Time for the test run. I pushed the raft into deeper water and carefully climbed aboard. The frame flexed slightly under my weight, but the pods kept everything level and stable. A few adjustments to the rope tension, and I had myself a genuine certified by necessity watercraft. It floats, I announced, as if this was somehow surprising. But how? Pip demanded, scanner still beeping. According to my calculations, that configuration shouldn't provide adequate buoyancy for your body mass. Physics, Pip. The pods displace water equal to their volume. The total displacement is greater than our combined weight, therefore we float. It's not complicated. But what about stability calculations? Hydrodynamic efficiency, wave resistance coefficients? I paddled the raft in a small circle using one of the floating equipment cases as an improvised oar. What about them? It floats, it holds people, and it moves when you paddle it. That's all the coefficients I need. This was apparently the point where my alien classmates realized that maybe, just maybe, the primitive human might actually know what he was doing. Grok was the first to accept reality. Human Jake Raft works better than Grok Fortress. Grok impressed with human not rock engineering. Zephyr was still skeptical, but his skepticism was being rapidly eroded by the fact that he was now chin deep in flood water. This seems very unsafe. There are no safety railings, no emergency systems, no backup protocols. Zephyr, I said, extending a hand to help him climb aboard. The backup protocol is try not to fall off. Welcome to human safety standards. Pip was running continuous scans on the raft structure, muttering calculations under his breath. Buoyancy coefficient holding steady, structural integrity within acceptable parameters. This is remarkable. You built a functional watercraft using nothing but debris and primitive joining techniques. We call it MacGyvering, I explained, helping him climb aboard. Named after an ancient Earth hero who could build anything out of paperclips and determination. The raft settled lower in the water with all four of us aboard, but it held steady. The emergency pods were doing their job. The frame was distributing weight evenly, and my knots were holding like they'd been tied by someone who actually knew what he was doing. Which, to be fair, I did. You don't grow up in Detroit without learning how to tie things together in ways that will hold under pressure. This is actually working, Zephyr said, sounding genuinely amazed. We're floating, on water, without proper maritime certification. Sometimes, I said, grabbing my improvised paddle, the best certification is not drowning. That's when the Academy's communication system crackled to life with a new message, this one significantly more urgent than the previous announcements. Attention all cadets. Due to the complete failure of our drainage systems, water levels are expected to rise an additional 4 feet in the next hour. All training exercises are hereby suspended. Please make your way to the emergency evacuation point at the administration building. Try not to die. That is all. 4 more feet of water. The administration building was half a mile away across what used to be the training grounds, and was now a very large, very deep lake. Time to see if my floating masterpiece was up for a real test drive. All right everyone, I announced, pushing off from our rapidly disappearing patch of higher ground. Welcome aboard the good ship I told you so. Next stop, dry land and a serious conversation with whoever designed this planet's weather management system. And for the first time since this whole disaster started, I actually felt like we might make it out of this alive. Not because of advanced alien technology or sophisticated emergency protocols or any of the fancy systems that were supposed to keep us safe, but because sometimes when all the complex solutions fail, what you really need is some rope, some floating things, and the kind of stubborn human refusal to admit that a problem can't be solved. What followed was the most surreal boat ride of my life. And I once took a ferry during a hurricane because I was too stubborn to admit that maybe traveling during severe weather warnings wasn't the best idea. Our makeshift raft cut through the floodwater with all the grace and dignity of a shopping cart with a wobbly wheel, but it was floating, it was moving, and nobody was drowning. In the current situation, this qualified as a stunning engineering success. I had appointed myself captain by virtue of being the only one who knew how boats worked, which is to say I knew you put the paddle in the water and moved it around until you went in the direction you wanted. Advanced maritime knowledge, clearly. Okay team, I announced, settling into my role as reluctant leader of this floating circus. Here's the plan. We paddle toward the administration building, we don't fall off, and we try to look like we know what we're doing when we get there. That's the entire plan? Pip asked, his scanner now permanently set to mild panic mode. What about contingencies? Backup routes? Risk mitigation strategies? Backup plan is don't drown, I replied. Adjusting our heading as we navigated around what used to be the Academy's prized botanical garden, and was now a very expensive lake. Risk mitigation strategy is hold on tight. I know it's not very sophisticated, but it has the advantage of being achievable. Zephyr had positioned himself at what he declared to be the regulatory compliance station, which was basically the middle of the raft where he could continue consulting his handbook while staying as far as possible from the scary water. According to Maritime Safety Regulation 15C, he announced, flipping through soggy pages, all watercraft must maintain a minimum speed of 3 knots to ensure proper maneuverability in emergency situations. Great, I said, paddling us around a submerged training obstacle. How fast are we going? Zephyr checked his instruments. Approximately 0.7 knots. Well, we're moving faster than the people who didn't build a raft, so I'm calling that a win. Grok had taken up position at the front of the raft, where he served as both lookout and ballast. His rock-solid mass helped keep us stable, and his height advantage meant he could spot obstacles before we ran into them. It was like having a living lighthouse, if lighthouses could punch things. Big floaty thing ahead, Grok reported, pointing toward what looked like one of the Academy's emergency shelters that had deployed successfully, then immediately flooded, because nobody had thought to include drainage. Can we go around it? I asked. Grok considered this with the tactical brilliance of his species. Can go around, can also go through. Grok prefers going through. We're going around, Grok. As we navigated the obstacle course that our training ground had become, I started to notice something interesting. My alien classmates, despite their initial panic and regulatory concerns, were actually pretty useful once they stopped trying to solve the problem with their species' preferred methods. Zephyr, for all his handbook obsession, had an incredible sense of direction and spatial awareness. His constant checking of regulations had given him an encyclopedic knowledge of the Academy's layout, and he was able to guide us toward the administration building, even when all the familiar landmarks were underwater. "Turn 15 degrees starboard," he directed, consulting what appeared to be a topographical map he'd memorized from the safety manual. "There's a drainage channel that runs beneath the main pathway. If we follow it, we can avoid the deeper sections near the dormitory complex." "See," I said, adjusting our course. "That's useful information, much better than trying to file a complaint with the flood." Grok's contribution was more direct but equally valuable. When we encountered debris too large to paddle around, he simply reached out with his massive arms and moved it out of our way. Floating equipment pods, submerged benches, even an entire emergency communication station that had broken loose from its moorings, Grok treated them all like minor inconveniences to be relocated. "Grok is good at water moving now," he announced proudly, after clearing a particularly stubborn piece of wreckage. "Water lighter than rocks, much easier to push around." Pip, meanwhile, had overcome his initial analytical paralysis and was now putting his processing power to good use. His scanner was tracking water levels, current speeds, and structural integrity of everything around us, providing real-time updates on the safest routes through the flood. "Current velocity increasing near the science building," he reported. "Suggest heading 20 degrees port to avoid accelerated water flow. Also, there appears to be some kind of electrical discharge from the submerged power systems. Recommend maintaining minimum distance of 30 meters. Good catch, Pip. Electrocution wasn't on my list of preferred ways to end this exercise. We were actually working as a team now. Not the kind of team the Academy had envisioned, where everyone followed their predetermined roles and protocols, but the kind of team that forms when survival depends on everyone contributing what they're actually good at instead of what they're supposed to be good at. It was about halfway to the administration building when we encountered our first real challenge. The flood had created a strong current where the main drainage system was trying to handle more water than it was designed for, creating a river within the flood that was moving fast enough to be genuinely dangerous. "That's not good," I observed, watching debris getting swept along at speeds that would turn our carefully constructed raft into expensive kindling. "Current velocity approximately 8 knots, Pip reported, his scanner beeping urgently, significantly above safe navigation parameters for our vessel configuration. Translation: we go in there, we're going to have a very short, very exciting ride to somewhere we don't want to be," I said. Zephyr was already consulting his maps. "The current follows the old storm drainage system. It runs directly beneath the dormitory complex and exits into the emergency reservoir system behind the Academy." "Where's the emergency reservoir?" I asked, though I was pretty sure I didn't want to know. "It's a 500-foot drop into a concrete containment facility designed to handle catastrophic flooding." "Yeah, that's definitely not where we want to end up." This was the kind of problem that required actual problem solving, not just following the current and hoping for the best. The administration building was on the other side of this artificial river, and going around would add at least another hour to our journey. An hour we probably didn't have, given that the water was still rising and the Academy's emergency systems were still broadcasting increasingly creative explanations for why everything was perfectly normal. "Options?" I asked my crew. "We could construct a temporary bridge using available materials," Pip suggested. "Required components: approximately 40 meters of structural support, anchoring systems rated for current load, and engineering specifications I don't actually have." "We could fight the water," Grok offered. "Grok good at fighting things now." "We could file a formal request for current velocity reduction," Zephyr added helpfully. I looked at the rushing water, then at my floating collection of alien misfits, then at the administration building tantalizingly close on the other side of our liquid obstacle. "Or," I said, "we could do something really stupid that might actually work." That got everyone's attention. "You see that submerged building over there?" I pointed to what had been the Academy's equipment storage facility, now mostly underwater but with its roof still visible above the flood line. "If we can get the raft up onto that roof, we can use it as a launching platform to jump the current." "Jump the current," Zephyr squawked. "That's not a recognized maritime maneuver. There's no regulation for jumping currents." "That's because it's not a maritime maneuver," I explained. "It's more of a hold-on-and-pray maneuver, very popular in human emergency response." Pip's scanner was already running calculations. "Trajectory analysis indicates a 43% probability of successful transit, assuming optimal launch angle and velocity." Failure scenarios include capsizing, structural collapse, and what my database classifies as uncontrolled aquatic dispersal of crew members. I like those odds, I said, which was technically true since they were better than our odds of going around or trying to paddle through the current. Grok was examining the submerged building with professional interest. Roof looks strong. Grok can check roof strength by jumping on it. Please don't jump on it until we're not standing on it, I said quickly. Getting onto the roof required some creative maneuvering and a lot of faith in my knot tying skills, but we managed to paddle the raft up a submerged ramp and onto the flat surface of the building. The roof was solid enough to support us, which was more than I'd honestly expected. From our elevated position, I could see the current more clearly. It was fast and dangerous, but it was also relatively narrow. If we could get enough speed and hit it at the right angle, we might be able to skip across it like a stone across a pond. A very heavy raft-shaped stone, carrying 4 people who really hoped physics would cooperate just this once. Everyone ready? I asked, positioning us at the edge of the roof. This is highly irregular, Zephyr muttered, but he was gripping the raft's frame with determined talons. Grok ready for water jumping, Grok announced with enthusiasm that was either admirable or terrifying. Statistical probability of survival holding steady at 43%, Pip reported, which is actually better than I expected for a plan this insane. That's the spirit, I said, and pushed us off the roof. For a moment we were airborne, actually flying through the air on a raft made of emergency equipment and determination, which was either the coolest thing I'd ever done, or the stupidest, depending on how it turned out. We hit the current with a splash that soaked everyone, and a jolt that tested my rope work to its absolute limits. The raft flexed, twisted, and for one terrifying second, I thought we were going to come apart like a wishbone at Thanksgiving. But the knots held, the frame held, and most importantly, our momentum carried us across the current and into the calmer water on the other side. We made it, Zephyr said, sounding genuinely surprised. We actually made it. That was completely against regulations, and it worked. Sometimes, I said, wringing flood water out of my shirt, the best regulation is the one that says whatever works. The administration building was now just a few hundred meters away, rising out of the flood like a very bureaucratic island. I could see other cadets and instructors on the upper floors, watching our approach with the kind of expressions usually reserved for witnessing either a miracle or a complete breakdown of everything they thought they understood about the universe. You know, Pip said, as we paddled toward our destination, I'm going to have to completely revise my database entries for human problem-solving capabilities. What are you going to put? I asked. Category impossible but effective. Subcategory, makes no sense but somehow works anyway. Priority level, do not underestimate. And as we pulled up to the administration building's emergency dock, where Academy officials were waiting with expressions of bewildered relief, I couldn't help but feel a little proud of our floating disaster of a raft. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't regulation, and it definitely wasn't the kind of solution they taught in advanced crisis management. But it had gotten 4 cadets safely across a flooded training ground when all the official emergency systems had failed. Sometimes the best engineering isn't about having the right equipment or following the proper procedures. Sometimes it's about having some rope, some floating things, and the stubborn human conviction that there's always a way to solve the problem, even if that way involves jumping currents on a homemade raft while alien classmates file regulatory complaints with the weather. The emergency dock at the administration building was buzzing with the kind of controlled chaos that happens when very important people suddenly realize that their very expensive systems have failed in very spectacular ways. Academy officials in their pristine uniforms were running around with datapads trying to look like they had everything under control while clearly having no idea what to do about a training planet that had decided to cosplay as an ocean. Emergency response teams were coordinating rescue efforts for cadets stranded across the flooded grounds, using equipment that was apparently designed by people who had never seen actual water before. And into this scene of bureaucratic panic came our little raft, carrying 4 soggy cadets who had somehow managed to navigate half a mile of floodwater using nothing but rope, floating debris, and what the Academy would probably classify as dangerously improvised problem-solving. Commander Vextar, the Academy's head of emergency operations, was waiting at the dock with the expression of someone who'd been having a very long day that had just gotten significantly longer. He was a Zentaurian, which meant he looked like someone had crossed a professional accountant with a very serious lizard, and his species was known for their methodical approach to crisis management. Cadets, he announced as we pulled up to the dock, please disembark in an orderly fashion and report to the emergency processing station for medical evaluation and incident documentation. Sure thing, I said, tying our raft to the dock with a bowline knot that would probably outlast the building. Fair warning though, our incident documentation is going to be pretty entertaining reading. Commander Vextar's expression suggested that entertaining reading was not what he was hoping for from this situation. The first surprise came when the medical team ran their scans on us. Apparently they were expecting to find cadets suffering from exposure, hypothermia, shock, and various other conditions associated with surviving a completely unprecedented natural disaster. Instead, they found 4 individuals who were wet, tired, and remarkably healthy, considering they'd just navigated a flood zone on a homemade raft. This is unusual, the medical technician announced, reviewing his scanner readings. According to these results, you've actually maintained optimal hydration levels and show no signs of stress-related physiological impact. That's because we weren't panicking, I explained. Panic is bad for your health. Much better to build a boat and get on with it. The technician looked at me like I'd just explained that gravity was optional if you believed in yourself hard enough. Meanwhile, the Academy's investigative team was examining our raft with the kind of intense scrutiny usually reserved for alien artifacts or evidence from crime scenes. They measured everything, scanned everything, and took enough photographs to fill a small museum. This construction is highly irregular, announced Chief Engineer Kexnoth, a crystalline whose body looked like someone had taught a chandelier to walk upright. The structural integrity calculations don't support the observed performance characteristics. What does that mean in simple terms? Commander Vextar asked. It means this thing shouldn't work, but it obviously does. Kexnoth replied, running another scan on my rope knots. The joining techniques are primitive, the materials are improvised, and the overall design violates at least 12 established principles of maritime engineering. And yet, I pointed out, it got us here safely, while your advanced emergency systems were busy playing smooth jazz and telling everyone that water isn't wet. That comment earned me some very sharp looks from the investigation team, but I noticed that none of them could actually argue with it. The real fun started when they tried to document exactly what had happened. The Academy's incident reporting system was designed to handle standard emergencies with standard responses using standard equipment. It was not designed to handle human builds boat out of garbage and saves everyone. Classification of rescue vessel, the reporting officer asked, stylus poised over his datapad. Raft, I said helpfully. Raft is not a recognized vessel classification for Academy emergency response scenarios. How about floating thing that works? The officer's expression suggested that this was not a helpful contribution to the documentation process. Zephyr, meanwhile, had found himself in the unique position of being the only cadet who could provide a complete regulatory analysis of our adventure. He'd spent the entire flood documenting violations, filing complaints, and cross-referencing handbook sections, which meant he had the most comprehensive record of everything that had gone wrong. According to my documentation, he announced to the debriefing panel, we encountered approximately 47 distinct regulatory violations during the course of this emergency. 47 violations, Commander Vextar repeated with the tone of someone who was developing a serious headache. Please elaborate. Well, there was unauthorized weather, improper equipment usage, construction without permits, maritime operations without certification, violation of safety protocols, deviation from approved emergency procedures. Zephyr continued for another 10 minutes, reading from his exhaustive list of everything that had technically been against regulations during our escape. The officials listened with increasing amazement, not because of the violations, but because he'd managed to document everything so thoroughly while literally fleeing for his life. And yet, Commander Vextar observed when Zephyr finally finished, you're all here, safe and unharmed, having successfully evacuated from a crisis zone when our official emergency systems failed. Yes sir, Zephyr replied. It was highly irregular. Grok's contribution to the debriefing was characteristically direct. When asked to describe his role in the rescue, he simply said, Human Jake built good boat, Grok helped. Boat better than rocks for water problems. This profound engineering insight was duly recorded in the official incident report, where it would probably confuse Academy analysts for years to come. Pip had spent the debriefing period running continuous analysis on everything that had happened, and his conclusions were the most interesting of all. Statistical analysis of our survival indicates a success probability that should have been mathematically impossible given available resources and environmental conditions, he announced to the panel. The only variable that adequately explains our positive outcome is the implementation of what I can only classify as human-style problem-solving. And what exactly is human-style problem-solving? Asked Commander Vextar. Pip consulted his datapad. Characterized by immediate practical action rather than theoretical analysis, utilization of available materials regardless of their intended purpose, acceptance of imperfect solutions that achieve desired outcomes, and a remarkable disregard for statistical probability when survival is at stake. In other words, I added, we figured out what needed to be done, and then we did it, instead of spending 3 hours calculating whether it was theoretically possible. The investigation team spent another hour trying to understand exactly how I'd known what materials to use, how to construct a stable raft, and how to navigate the flood waters without any of the sophisticated equipment that was supposed to be necessary for water-based emergency response. Where did you learn maritime construction techniques? Chief Engineer Keksnath asked. I didn't, I replied. I learned how to tie knots, how things float, and how to not give up when the first solution doesn't work. But surely you must have studied naval architecture, hydrodynamics, emergency rescue protocols. Nope, I just grew up on a planet where weather happens whether you have permits for it or not. This seemed to break something in their understanding of how expertise was supposed to work. In their experience, you learn to solve problems by studying the approved methods for solving those specific problems. The idea that general principles and practical experience could be applied to novel situations was apparently revolutionary. The final surprise came when Academy Command issued their official response to the incident. I was expecting anything from a reprimand for violating safety protocols to a medal for successful emergency response, but what I got was something much more interesting. Cadet Martinez, Commander Vextar announced at the formal debriefing session, Academy Command has reviewed the circumstances of your actions during the weather emergency and has reached the following conclusions. Here it comes, I thought. Probably a lecture about following proper procedures and not improvising solutions without authorization. First, your rapid adaptation to emergency conditions and successful evacuation of your team demonstrates exceptional practical problem-solving capabilities that exceed standard Academy expectations. Okay, that wasn't what I expected. Second, your construction and operation of an improvised rescue vessel using available materials represents a level of resource utilization efficiency that our emergency response protocols apparently lack. This was getting interesting. Third, your leadership during the crisis resulted in 0 casualties, 0 equipment losses, and 0 need for external rescue assistance, which compares favorably to the 17 other cadet teams that required emergency evacuation. Wait, 17 other teams needed rescue, and we were the only ones who got ourselves out. Therefore, Academy Command is implementing the following changes to our emergency response curriculum: mandatory coursework in improvisational problem solving, expanded training in resource adaptation techniques, and the addition of primitive but effective solutions to our crisis management protocols. Commander Vextar paused to look directly at me. Additionally, we're redesignating your species classification from Tier C to Tier with a specialization notation in emergency adaptation and unconventional solution implementation. Tier A. From the bottom of the survival rankings to the top, just because I'd built a raft and refused to panic when it started raining. Furthermore, the commander continued, you're being assigned as a special instructor for our new human-style problem-solving workshop, which will be mandatory for all advanced cadets. And that's how I went from being the token primitive human to being the guy who taught the galaxy's future military leaders how to solve problems with rope and stubbornness. The best part came later, when I was reviewing the official incident report. Buried in the technical appendices was a note from the Academy's engineering department that made me laugh out loud. Requests submitted for immediate research into human construction techniques, with particular focus on knot-based structural systems and improvised buoyancy solutions. Preliminary analysis suggests that human engineering methods may offer significant advantages in resource-limited scenarios where conventional protocols prove inadequate. Translation: we have no idea how he did that, but we want to figure it out because apparently our fancy technology isn't as smart as a guy with some rope. 3 months later, when the new cadets arrived for their first semester, they found a permanent addition to the Academy's emergency equipment inventory: a rack of basic rope, a selection of empty containers, and a manual titled Emergency Construction Techniques for When Everything Else Fails. The manual's dedication read, to Jake Martinez, who proved that sometimes the most advanced solution is the simplest one that actually works. And honestly, I couldn't think of a better way to sum up the whole experience. When the weather decided to ignore the regulations, when the emergency systems decided to play jazz instead of saving lives, and when all the theoretical knowledge in the galaxy couldn't handle a little unexpected rain, what saved the day wasn't advanced technology or sophisticated protocols. It was some rope, some floating things, and the kind of stubborn human refusal to accept that a problem can't be solved just because nobody's written a manual for it yet. Sometimes, the most primitive solution is the most advanced one of all.